According to a new report from the Environmental Protection Agency, 40% of domestic septic tanks in Clare failed inspection last year, putting drinking water, wells and rivers all at risk. The latest report from the EPA shows 97 inspections were completed in this county in 2025, with 80% of those fixed at the end of the year. Only 5 other counties, namely Limerick, Donegal, Cork, Galway and Wexford, had higher failure rates last year than Clare. The EPA has found that between 2013 and 2025, 316 systems were deemed to have failed in this county. To discuss this further, I'm now joined on the line by Lorcan Farrell, an inspector from the Environmental Protection Agency. Lorcan, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Daragh, and good morning to your listeners. Yeah, I suppose today the EPA launched their 2025 report on local authority inspections of domestic wastewater treatment systems, and those will be better known to your listeners as septic tanks. Now, our report today shows that almost 1,500 inspections were completed nationally by local authorities in 2025, with almost 6 in 10 failing inspection. I suppose on the positive side there, 84% of septic tanks that failed inspection nationally since 2013 have been fixed, and that is a very positive number, as that number is rising over the last couple of years. And these are inspections that are targeted at high risk areas, so that's a positive piece. But I suppose the 6 in 10 number is a worrying statistic, as faulty septic tanks, I suppose they can pose a risk to drinking water wells and our rivers and streams, so they must be resolved by homeowners when the systems fail inspection.
You mentioned there, Lorcan, that you've been targeting septic tanks for inspection that are in high-risk areas. What constitutes a high-risk area, particularly in Clare?
So the risk, I suppose the high-risk areas are set out in the EPA's National Inspection Plan, and the local authorities carry out their inspections according to the National Inspection Plan. So basically, there's 2 zones there. So there's a risk to human health and there's a risk to the environment. So in terms of human health, the risk from septic tanks can be that they can contaminate your drinking water well, if there's one on your property, with kind of bacteria and viruses and pathogens that might make you or your family ill. And then there's also, if there's ponding of the septic tank, there can be direct exposure to leaking, or overflowing or ponding that happens down the end of the garden, maybe where your septic tank is. And then there's the risk to the environment. So that's a different zone under the National Inspection Plan. And the septic tanks have been identified as a significant pressure on our at-risk rivers and lakes. So the inspections are basically broken down into those 2 zones, and each county has a different allocation of inspections depending on how much of their county is in each zone.
So it's more so septic tanks that are near, like you said, their wells and maybe areas of significant biodiversity or rivers and streams that would be threatened if they were to, I suppose, be exposed to a leak.
Yes, absolutely. So I suppose the risk to the environment there, so those will be properties with septic tanks that will be within 100 metres of a water body that's where it's been recognised that septic tanks are significant pressure on the water body. And then, yes, if there's a drinking water well on site, or if there could potentially be increased risk there. So we target areas with shallow soils where the bedrock is close to the surface. So that would be the other zone.
It certainly sounds very concerning that we have the 6th highest failure rate nationwide. Why is the failure rate so high in Clare, and what are the consistent reasons for failure that you're seeing?
Well, the failure rate is kind of middle of the road for Clare. There's actually a good few more counties that have a higher failure rate in 2025. But I suppose the failure rate nationally runs in and around the 50%. It's slightly higher this year, coming in at 59%. That's the 6 in 10 number nationally. So Clare is just slightly below that. But each county, I suppose, has different failure rates, and those are down to, I suppose, local conditions and where local authorities base their inspections for that particular year. So there is that variation.
And is there some types of properties that are consistently more at risk than others?
Not necessarily. It might be down to the local conditions and soil and that, but I suppose each homeowner is responsible for their septic tank, and there can be problems from septic tanks outside of these areas that are inspected as well. So the EPA would call on, I suppose, all homeowners to maintain their septic tanks and just go down. See, a lot of the times septic tanks can be down the end of the garden and they're out of sight and out of mind. So we would ask homeowners to go down and take a look at them themselves. And there can be kind of two main causes of failure there. There can be construction issues, so that might be just leaks from the tank, direct discharges to streams, or issues with the percolation area. So if you go down and the area is a bit wet down where your percolation area is for your septic tank, there might be an issue there. And what you can do in that situation is we would call for homeowners to, I suppose, adequately maintain their septic tanks, and that would involve maybe getting them emptied out at regular intervals, roughly every 3 to 4 years. Just to make sure that I suppose issues don't persist or get worse with their tanks. Yeah.
And that was something that I noticed from your report, was that there's 95 inspections required in Clare every year. So Clare County Council estimates that we could have up to 30,000 septic tanks in the county. So what can homeowners do to be proactive about it? You mentioned there you can get your tank emptied every couple of years, but is there a more, I suppose, time-consuming way, something you can do a bit more often to make sure that, you're not harming the ground surface, you're not harming any drinking water wells, that you're certainly not harming maybe any local livestock either?
Yes, definitely there is. As I was saying there, just I suppose go down and take a look. It's not that often that we go down and take a look at our septic tanks, because they might be down the end of the garden, they might be in an adjacent field, so like that out of sight, out of mind. So go down and take a look. If it's quite wet down there, especially during let's say a dry period where you'd expect the ground to be good and firm, if it's wet in that, you might have a problem there. So the first step we would say is get your tank desludged if it hasn't been done in a few years. We say every 3 to 4 years. Depending on the tank and how many people are in the house. There's guidance on that on the EPA website that your listeners can access. But then if the problems persist, you can engage a local contractor maybe that specialises in septic tanks to come out and have a look at it yourself, or have a look at it themselves, and then just see if there's any kind of issue. And I suppose the other thing we would recommend to people, because if you have a septic tank, you're more likely to have a private drinking water well on site. So the EPA would call for homeowners to test their private wells just to make sure that there's no pathogens making their way from maybe a faulty septic tank over to a drinking water well, or indeed a well belonging to a neighbour, or a well that's feeding livestock or that.
And look, thankfully we're not the worst end of the scale here as well. Look, we see there are some counties, the likes of Westmeath, the likes of Cork City too, where they're really in the red zone, and the low rate of failures fixed at the end of the year. How bad can things get? What sort of risks can this pose to public health?
I suppose that the main risk would be through contaminated drinking water wells, and I suppose that's a well recognised issue, that if there's any transmission between, let's say, a faulty septic tank and a drinking water well. So again, for your listeners to test their well. We say every year, I suppose, and then if there is any ponding or that, just get your tank, I suppose, sorted out. And then I suppose the other side of it is the environmental end. Like I suppose we're all very conscious of biodiversity and the quality of our water bodies as well. If there's a direct discharge going from your septic tank into a ditch, that then can move on to one of our local streams, and then that adds to the pressures that are on our local water bodies. So again, getting out to have a look themselves. And then I suppose the other side of it is if Clare County Council or any local authority comes out to do an inspection, it's because your property is in one of the higher risk zones. So if your septic tank fails inspection, it's in a higher risk zone, and what happens then is the local authority will issue an advisory notice which stipulates the improvement improvements you might need to make to your tank or any kind of remediation work. Now, in that case, there are grants available to help homeowners out, and those grants increased from €5,000 up to €12,000 there in 2024, and they're available to get these septic tanks fixed once they fail inspection. But there's also other grant schemes there that are available. There's the High Status Objective Catchments Area Scheme and the Priority Areas for Action, and your local authority is best placed to advise you on that, because the grants are issued by the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, but they're issued by the local authority. So your local authority is best placed there, and they will know your local conditions. And there's been a big uptake in grants over the last year. I suppose in 2025, 460 grants were drawn down versus 265 the previous year. So that represents €4.77 million paid out in grants in 2025.
Well, that's certainly something useful to get out there, because I'd imagine that could be seen as a barrier to fixing your tank or even investigating the issue yourself, is the cost of repairing this. So does somebody have to have an inspection first and to be told, look, you have a problem here that needs addressing? And if so, can they approach the local authority to organise that?
Well, I suppose no. At the minute, the current scheme is that if you fail an inspection, you are eligible for a grant. Now, there are other mechanisms, so the Priority Areas for Action and the High Status Objective Catchment Areas, that the local authority would know which part of the county that you're in, so you may be eligible. But sometimes people aren't eligible for grants to fix their septic tanks. Now, I know there is potentially a change coming to grants at some stage, so that might widen the scope. But at the moment, the primary mechanism is if failing inspection.
Certainly important to keep on top of the health of your septic tank anyways. Lorcan Farrell from the Environmental Protection Agency. Lorcan, thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Daragh.
That was Lorcan Farrell from the Environmental Protection Agency.